Mao is coding cat. Today we're solving Leetcode question 338, longest absolute file path. So in this question, we are given an input string representing a file system. And the goal is to find out what's the longest absolute file path embedded in the string. In order to solve the problem, the most important thing is to understand how was this file system path constructed. So a file path system is essentially a tree structure. So over here, we have the root directory, and the root directory can contain other subdirectories, and each subdirectories can include more subdirectories or files. In order to construct the file system string, we start from the root node. And after the name of the directory is recorded, we use the end-line character to represent the end of the directory name. And then we use a tab character to indicate the beginning of a subdirectory name or a file name. We use one tab character if the subdirectory or the file is one level from the root directory. And we use two tab characters if it's two level from the directory. And we use three tab characters if the file or the subdirectory is three levels from the root directory. Looking at the file system string, we can see that whenever we encounter an end-line character, then that means we are just finished with an element in the file system. And each element in the file system starts from n number of tab characters. The n can be 0 if we're talking about the root directory itself, and n is 1 if it's a subdirectory or a file that is one level from the root directory. And it's 2 if the file or the subdirectory located at two levels from the root directory. Here is our solution implemented in Python. So in the solution, the first step is to break up the file system string into chunks. And each chunk is essentially one element from the file system. And whenever we have a chunk, first we want to identify which level that chunk is from. The level of the chunk can be identified by the number of tab character preceding the element itself. So we know that if there is no tab character at all, then we're encountering the name of the root directory, so level 0. Then if we find one tab character, then we're looking at an element belonging to level 1. If there are two tab characters, then we're dealing with an element from the second level of the files. After we identify the level of the element, we want to calculate what's the absolute file path. So over here, we know that if the level is 0, we're looking at a file in the root directory. So the absolute file path is nothing but the length of the element itself. But if we're dealing with an element from a further level down the file system, then we need to find out what's the length of the subdirectory containing this file or subdirectory. If the element we're dealing with is not in the root directory, then first we want to retrieve the absolute file path length of its parent directory. So let's say that we're looking at this element. First, we want to retrieve what's the absolute file path length from the root directory all the way until its parent directory. And then we add 1, which is the slash character, and then we add the length of the element itself. Then we're checking, is the element that we just seen a file? If it's a file, we want to update because this file path length might be the longest we will ever see in the entire process. So we want to update this value. And if it's not a file, that means we've just seen a subdirectory. Then we want to record in this variable, say that at this level, I just saw a subdirectory with this length, and this length is the absolute file path length all the way until this subdirectory. And this subdirectory locates at this level. Now let's walk through an example. So if our input is like this file system structure, this will be the string that we end up getting. The first step, we break it up by end-line characters. So this example is actually quite long. Then we process each of the elements that we get from breaking it down by the end-line characters. The first guy we see is dir, which is the root directory. We're going here, we see that, is there any tab character before this chunk? There's nothing, so that means it's at level 0. then what's the file path length is nothing but the length of itself, which is 3 here. This over here is essentially the length of dir. And we go in here, we see that is this guy a file? There's no dot in the chunk, so there is not a file. Then it must be a directory. And we know that it's at level 0. So after this step, path will be 0, 3. Then we're going to the second chunk. After we're going to the second chunk, we check here. We see that, oh, there is one type character. So that means the level is 1. So over here, we have level equal to 1. And then we check what's the file path length. We know that the level is not 0. So first, we have to include the absolute file path length of its parent directory. So we check in this value, we see that, oh, okay, at level 0, we saw a directory with length 3. So over here, this guy is 3. And then we add a slash, and then we add the name of the element, which is subdir, so 6 over here. And then we go into this step, we check that, oh, okay, this guy is not a file, so we don't need to update it. Then it must be a subdirectory. So over here, we know that we just find an element with level 1, and the corresponding absolute file path is 3 plus 1 plus 6 over here, which is 10. So now the path dictionary has a value like this. And now we go to the third element. Same thing, we check that there are 2 type characters. That means it's at level 2. So over here, we have level 2. And at level 2, first, we need to find out what's the absolute file path of its parent directory. So in the variable, we see that we just saw an element at level 1, a subdirectory at level 1 with absolute file path 10. So this guy will be 10, and we add a slash, and we add the length of the element itself, which is f1.txt is 6. And we check, is this guy a file? Oh, we see that, oh, there is a dot in the element, so it is a file. Then over here, we do a comparison. Max we've seen so far is 0, and the file path length of this element will be 10 plus 1 plus 6 is 17. So now the max so far will be updated to 17. And because this element is a file, not a subdirectory, we don't have to do any update over here. The file variable will stay as this value. And now we go to this element. From this element, we see that there is a 1 type character at the beginning. So there is, the level is 1. And at level 1, first, we need to find out what's the absolute file path of its parent directory. So in this variable, we see that at level 0, we've seen a subdirectory with length 3. So this guy will be 3. And then we add the slash, we add the name of this element itself, which is subdir, so its length is 6. Then we go here, we see that it's not a file, so we don't update it here, but it's a subdirectory, so we need to update it here. And we see that we know that this element is at level 1 and its length is 10. So over here, we want to update this variable. 1 will be 10. So this is actually a bad example because they have the same name, but even if the length is different, it wouldn't really influence the result. So let's say if the subdir 2, then the length over here will be, the total length over here will be 11. Then we'll just update this variable to be 1 to 11 at level 1, and the absolute file path length is 11. And then we do the same thing over here. We see that there are 2 tab characters is at level 2. And when we encounter a level 2 element, first we want to find out is the length of its parent, absolute file path length of its parent directory. So we go into this variable, we see that at level 1, we just saw a subdirectory with length 11. So over here, this is 11, this is 1, and this will be sub-dir, so it's 9. And we're going here is not a file, but it's a subdirectory, and the length is 21. Then we come here, we want to update. We say that we just saw a subdirectory at level 2 with length 21. And then we'll do the same thing with the last element. So last element, we see that 3 tabs, this is level 3. And when we come here, we see that level 3, so first we want to find out what's the absolute file path of its parent. Level 3, and in this variable, we see that we just saw a subdirectory at level 2 with length 11. So this guy is 11, we add a slash, and level 3, the length of the element itself, which is f2.txt, is 6. So we have a total length of 28. And then we come in here, we say that, is this a file? It is a file. And the earlier we saw was the file from directory to subdir to file 1. And it has a certain length. And we compare it with the current one, 28, and we check which one is larger. And over here, 28 is larger. So we'll update max so far to be 28. It's not a subdirectory. We don't need to update the path variable. And then voila, that's the end of the chunks. Then we just return the max so far, which is 28. And that's it for this question. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Bye.